Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Getting Started, How to Form an ADA Team for Self-Evaluation. This is Fred Garcia from the Department of Administrative Services, Office of DEI. I'll be moderating today's session, and I'm excited to support Ohio's commitment to inclusion. Just a couple quick announcements before we begin. First, we invite you to submit your questions or comments in the meeting chat. The presenter, Robin, will do her best to address these at the end of the session. Second, this session is being recorded and may be posted online or made available for on-demand access. Getting started, how to form an ADA team for self-evaluation will be presented today by Robin A. Jones from the Great Lakes ADA Center. Robin is the principal investigator and project director of the Great Lakes ADA Center, as well as an instructor within the Department on Disability and Human Development at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And now please welcome Robin Jones.
Great. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to today's session. And this is kind of one of two that will be somewhat back to back if you decide to go to both of them. That is going to be really looking at this whole issue of self-evaluation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. As introduced, my name is Robin Jones. I am a white female over the age of 60. I wear black rimmed glasses. I have short hair that is violet in color. And today I'm wearing a white jacket with a white and black scarf around my neck. So as indicated, we're going to be talking about self-evaluation, and this is a part of a two-part session. That this first part, we're going to be really talking about kind of the process of getting started and what you need to think about in your planning process and making sure that you have all of the ducks in a row, I guess, as you start the process itself. So just to start and make sure that we're all on the same page. Again, statistically, we're talking about the fact that there are about 54 million people with disabilities. It's over 20% of the population of people with disabilities. So as we look at being a state government entity, we serve a huge population in our state, since we are statewide, obviously. So the numbers are high. Numbers of persons with severe disability, about 29 million, or almost 10%. I want to talk about severe disability, that being disability that impacts multiple areas of self-care, mobility, etc. Of the numbers, when you break it down, you're looking about 1.8 million using wheelchairs, about 8.8 with vision issues, about 10.1 hearing. Both those numbers of vision and hearing increase significantly as we age. About 1.6 million are blind, about 1 million are deaf. So again, when I make the distinction between vision problems and blind, vision problems being low vision, hearing problems being individuals who have low that are hard of hearing. That's different than somebody who would be blind, unable to see, or somebody who's deaf who is unable to hear. And about 15 million live with some form of mental illness. So really talking about, large numbers across the board, and much of this is invisible disability. So it really requires that not just a response to those things that we know and see, but also that we don't know. Demographically, we cannot miss the fact that we have an aging population. I'm among those. Some of you in the crowd may also be. That we're the largest and fastest growing segment of the U.S. population. We know statistically that people with disabilities are living longer. The advances of science and medicine and such, people are more conscious of their health. People are retiring earlier, not working until they die, kind of a thing. The current estimates are by the year 2040, the number of persons with disabilities will triple from what it is right now. And the other thing is that people with disabilities are demanding more access to facilities, programs, and activities as they have become more empowered, knowing their rights, knowing that they have rights. They've grown up with rights. I mean, we're now on our third generation of what we call the ADA generation, kids who were born after the ADA was passed and are maturing into the post-secondary and workforce. At this time, these individuals have always had rights. They've had rights in education. They've had, through K through 12. Then they had rights in post-secondary ed and such. And now they're entering the workforce. Now they're in the community and such, and they know their rights and they're demanding their rights. Much different than the previous generations who oftentimes, accepted what was, accepted the excuses that might have been made about why something could or could not be done. That's really just no longer acceptable. And so that's really what calls us or upon us as a state to really reflect on what we do and make sure that our programs, services, and activities are accessible under the ADA. Understanding that actually we've had these obligations way before the ADA. The ADA only, what I call or refer to as often, has been the wake-up call for people or entities that are covered, because the state of Ohio has been accepting federal dollars for years and years and years, generations. And we've got the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which will have its 50th anniversary. So this year we're celebrating the 32nd anniversary of the passage of the ADA, but next year in 2023, we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Rehabilitation Act, more importantly, Section 504, which is the section that applies to the state of Ohio that states any entity that is a recipient of federal dollars, does not matter how much, $1, $2, $1 million, has the obligation to not discriminate against people with disabilities. And if you know the history of the ADA, you know the fact that the ADA is a mirror of Section 504, the only difference being Section 504 has a carrot and a stick attached. You want our federal dollars, you have to agree to do something, whereas the ADA does not have that associated with it. There is set named entities that are covered under the ADA, which is just a different impetus. And it brought in the private sector, which has not traditionally been recipients of federal funds, and it obviously then broadened the amount of accessibility that would be available to people with disabilities for that. But I think it's really important to keep in mind the work that we do here, and you go and moving forward and examining and looking at what the state of Ohio needs to do, and applauding or patting yourself on the back for what you've already done, is the fact that these are obligations that you have had for more than just the 32 years that the ADA has been around. Now, the self-evaluation and transition planning process under the ADA is actually found in the regulations only for Title II entities under the ADA. It's not Title III or public accommodations, like private businesses are not subject to the same type of requirements that the like local and state governments are. But it's found under Title II of the ADA, and actually all of these obligations were to have been completed by 1995. So the ADA was passed in 1990, and it set forth under the regulations that were issued in 1991 a path for states to move forward in regard to their compliance, and there were a series of deadlines that states were supposed to meet, and those were supposed to have been completed by 1995. Well, we know, and one of the reasons we're sitting here today is that we know that the states and local governments have not done this. In fact, I'm part of a research program that we're doing here at the University of Illinois, where we're doing a review of self-evaluation and transition plans that have been done by local governments, not state governments, but local governments. And we surveyed over 300, we chose a sampling of 300 communities across the country, and we found less than 5% compliance that of those 300 that had actually ever even done a self-evaluation or a transition plan. So we know this is something that, even though it was required under the ADA, because as with most pieces of legislation that are passed by the federal government, there is an enforcement process, but you couldn't afford the enforcement process that would be necessary to really actively enforce something like the ADA and these obligations that we're talking about. We're all taxpayers, and we all know what it takes, out of our check every month or every couple of weeks or whatever to pay our federal taxes and our state taxes. And that's what funds the federal government, and it funds the enforcement agencies like the Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, and such. And there's just no way that they could ever have enough funds to really have the enforcement process in place that is necessary or would be necessary to actually effectively enforce across the board what's needed to be done under these laws. So in some ways, it's a voluntary compliance situation, because you are required to comply until you get caught. not complying. So that the assumption is basically made that you will do what you're supposed to do, just as you and I, every day we follow the rules. We decide we're going to drive down the road, and are we going to drive 55 miles an hour? Are we going to go 75 miles an hour? Are we going to go 80 miles an hour if it's only a 60-mile-an-hour zone? Well, we know we're only supposed to drive 60 miles an hour, but we drive or choose to drive 75 miles an hour, and that's fine until we get caught. So what we know and what we do are often two different things. So we're going to kind of talk about the self-evaluation process, but in part of that, I just want to make sure everybody is aware that there are 5 administrative requirements that were set forth under the ADA Title II obligations. One of them is the designation of a responsible employee. This is typically is supposed to be somebody with sufficient authority to make decisions and take action. It's often referred to as an ADA coordinator, and you do have that, obviously, in the state of Ohio already. We see a lot of different models used for for ADA coordinators. We see typically that there is one named ADA coordinator for the state, whereas the buck stops there perspective. But then we also see that a delegation to departments and units of government, smaller units of the government, where they may have a designee in that department who has ADA responsibilities. Because it's impossible for somebody or one person to possibly know everything and anything and have their thumb on what's happening across every agency, every unit of state government. So this is something that we do see, but again, different models are used in how that is done. We see it sometimes shifted off or compartmentalized, where we have people who are designated to be responsible for the employment side of a department's ADA obligations. So they might have a reasonable accommodation coordinator who would be looking at employment issues for that state agency and such. And then you might have a separate person who's responsible for the program services and activities portion of what is carried out by that state agency. But again, this is a choice made by the entity as to how they want to and what works effectively for them. Typically then those individuals who are at the departmental level report up to and coordinate with the ADA coordinator at the state level. The second administrative requirement under the ADA is a grievance procedure, and that is to establish a procedure for addressing complaints regarding ADA compliance. Basically, the purpose and the reason for this is to have a process by which individuals can internally address whether or not they feel that they have been discriminated against without having to necessarily go to the federal agencies and file any kind of formal complaint or get their own attorney and look at filing a complaint in the courts against a state entity and such. So the grievance procedure is a critical process. Again, this might be customized to some degree across different departments, depending on what they do, what their exposure is to the public, what type of activities and such that they do, and also how they might handle complaints may differ depending on the department. But the importance is that there is a grievance procedure offered and in place. Notice to the public is a statement of ADA compliance that should be made available across multiple platforms, both in print, auditory, website, etc., so that people in the public domain know that the state of Ohio is complying with the ADA. And this is also where we typically would include information about if you feel or you need an accommodation to participate in a program, service, and activity offered by the state of Ohio. This is who you would contact. That information is often contained in that ADA compliance statement. And again, when I talk about it being available across multiple platforms, this is something that should appear in brochures. It should appear on the website. It should appear when, on flyers and things about programs. Anything that we're doing, we should be making sure that the public knows that if they need an accommodation, that the state of Ohio is willing and able to consider that request for accommodation, and this is how you would go about doing that. The fourth is what we're going to be focusing on is the conducting of a self-evaluation. And basically it's defined as an assessment of all programs and services to identify any barriers to participation by people with disabilities. Now, it's required of all entities regardless of their size. So even a small little township or a library or something of that nature that's controlled and operated by a governmental entity would be subject to this requirement, regardless of how big they are. And then the requirements under the 1991 regulations that were issued under Title II of the ADA stated that you must keep them on file for 3 years if you have 50 or more employees. And it was supposed to have been completed by 1993. Earlier, I talked about the completion of all of the requirements by 1995. That's because there's a transition plan requirement, which is the number 5 I'm going to talk about, which is the review of all of your physical facilities, which is different than a self-evaluation. So you've got a review of all your facilities, being your buildings and your sidewalks and your roadways and things of that nature, to ensure that structurally you are also accessible. So your program accessibility may have implications for architectural accessibility, but they are viewed and treated as separate issues. And then, as I said, the 5th requirement is the development of a transition plan. And the transition plan, again, identifies the architectural barriers that impact the access to programs and activities that are offered by a public entity. But this was only required for entities of 50 or more. And of course, the state of Ohio, probably being the largest employer in the state of Ohio, would have been obligated to do this. Again, this is a review of all your physical structures to see where you have barriers that would preclude someone potentially from gaining access. So your courthouses and your public state buildings, your state office buildings, your parks, any of those kinds of things would be included in this physical accessibility review of your facilities. And as I said, was it could be completed by July of 1995. So theoretically, you would have completed all this in 95, and you would have removed all your barriers, and the state of Ohio would be complete 100% barrier free, and all of your programs, services, and activities would be 100% compliant at this point. But we know that that is probably not a reality. We know that it's a process, it's a progression. People change positions. You may have started something, not finished it. You may have done something back in 1990 and it's never been revisited before and looked at. And since that time, you have a lot of programs that were discontinued and new programs that were started. And one has to ask, as we started those new programs, did we take into consideration all of the things around accessibility and stuff of that nature that are necessary? Can we affirmatively say that all of our programs, services, and accessible activities are fully accessible to persons with disabilities? So that's really the purpose of the revisiting of the self-evaluation process, whether you've done it before, pulling it out, dusting it off, and revisiting it, or if you've never done it, starting and saying, okay, here's where we're drawing the line in the sand today, and we're saying from here on out, we're going to be doing this process, and we're going to be taking action proactively. Whereas we may have been taking action all along, but we may have been taking it in a piecemeal approach. So one department may be farther ahead than another department, but when you have issues that occur, and when a person looks at the state of Ohio and its accessibility to programs, services, and activities, we're really talking about the state of Ohio in its entirety. We're not just talking about one department or one unit or one office and one building. So that's really the purpose of really looking at this from a high level, from the drone level on down. So just to clarify and make distinction between the self-evaluation and the transition plan, because they are related, but they're very different. So the self-evaluation, as I said, it's a review of policies, practices, and procedures, and it requires you to look at whether we have or need to make reasonable modifications to our policies, practices, and procedures in order to ensure that people with disabilities have full and equal access. Whereas the transition plan is to identify structural and communication barriers to programs, services, and activities, and then have a schedule in place of how we're going to remove those barriers. So these would be architectural barriers in place. So example would be if we have a building that doesn't have a ramp on it, we have a building that it doesn't have an elevator, and we have programs that are occurring on the second and third floor. How are we ensuring that those programs are accessible? Because we've now identified that we don't have vertical access, so we know we have that physical barrier, but we have these program services and activities that are occurring on the second floor. So in that self-evaluation process, I need to identify how am I going to continue to deliver those services that are on that second floor with no vertical access to the public. And I'm going to talk about the fact, like, for example, am I going to relocate that to a different location that is accessible? Am I going to offer an alternative method or a way for somebody to access their programs and services? An online option, a at home, a curbside option. How are we going to do that? That's going to be in our self-evaluation. We're going to identify what is that barrier, what's that program that we have, first of all, and then what's the barrier that exists, and how do we need to modify it to be able to make it accessible. So this is just a visual that gives you that side-by-side kind of a comparison between these two activities. But again, we're going to be focusing on the self-evaluation process today. This is just my little diagram to, stress the fact that the person who's the ADA or the accessibility coordinator, whatever terminology is used in the various units of government and such, is both a disability advocate as well as a compliance manager. They really are on that kind of teeter-tottering process there, and having to balance those things out, because they are really the voice and the consciousness of the organization for people with disabilities, but they're also for the organization, the compliance manager, and they're responsible to ensure that that entity does not get lawsuits filed against it, and that that entity is in compliance, and that entity has done what it needs to do, and that they've dotted all the I's and crossed all of the T's and things of that nature. But at the same time, understanding that people with disabilities may need things that, and there's this tension that sometimes can be created in the fact that the governmental entities pushing back because it's too expensive, and or they're resistive to making the change. An individual department really doesn't want to do it differently than they've done it before, and you've got this ADA coordinator saying, hey, but in order to be compliant with the ADA, we need to do this. We need to come up and figure out a way to be able to do this, because we need to make sure that people with disabilities have access. But I understand the budget issues. I'm part of the government. I also am part of the fact that there's only so many tax dollars to do these things or whatever. So it's really that balancing game, and it's really important to keep in mind that that person that's in that position, that person in your individual departments who's playing the role of helping your constituents to gain access and such, you're both an advocate for them, but you're also responsible for your own compliance in your department or your division. So just some things to think about as you begin this process, and needs to kind of be in place before you start to start the process is number one is securing support from the top. I can't stress enough how important it is that there be support from the top on down. This is not a bottom-up scenario. Yes, a lot of the work that occurs is going to be from the bottom up, because it's going to be people that are the boots on the ground that are doing the work on this, and they're the ones who know the most about what is occurring in your program services and activities and such. But you have to have that support from the top. Somebody from the top needs to be messaging and such all the time that the importance of this, and that this is something that is top priority for the state of Ohio. And I think you've demonstrated that through the commitment of the office that you have, and the structures that you have in place, and the supports like this conference to try to educate people on the ongoing education and stuff that goes on. But really is important also that it's not just your governor, but it's also your legislature, because when it comes down to budgeting and appropriations and things of that nature that need to be done, they need to be behind this 100% as well. Building your team, who's going to own it? And I'm going to talk more about that as we go on, but it does take a team. This is not a single thing. This is not something that just the office of the ADA coordinator can take on independently. It's too big. It's too big of a beast. I might be able to do something like that in a small municipality or a small township that might have far fewer employees, far fewer program services and activities, but not at the state level. look at and finalize the depth and the breadth of the analysis that you're going to use. How high and how high are you going to fly with this issue? Are you going to just do a cursory review, or are you going to dig deep? You really need to make a decision about that. And I'm not going to say there's one or the right way or the wrong way to do that. It really depends on where you believe your organizations already are, and how, what's going to benefit your constituency and your agencies most in doing this. And when I say that, I say is, are we going to be looking at it, from the broadest angle, being we're going to do, department wide, and we're not going to drill down to each division or subdivision or each field office or whatever? Or are we also going to, get down into those individual field offices that might be doing things differently than somebody's doing it, in Columbus at the, at the State House, or whatever? Because that is important, because if you're doing it differently and things are not consistently done, it does open some vulnerabilities for you as a state, to understand that, when someone experiences discrimination or a barrier at the state level, it is the entire state's resources, the entire state that is found at fault here. It's not just the individual department or the individual field office. It's every one of us acts on behalf of this much broader and bigger entity. So you really have to finalize how much are we going to go? What's the breadth and depth of what we're actually going to be able to do? We need to also establish the method for information gathering, and what kind of method we're going to use for analysis. What I mean by this is, are we going to do a centralized process for gathering information? Are we going to go the sophisticated route and do, some kind of web-based or cloud-based collection process, so that information is shared across the board, that people are using the same forms, that people can add and edit information collectively? How and what are we going to use and do for that gathering of information? Or are we going to go the low-tech route, and we're going to do it in good old paper and pencil? And in the end, we'll have stacks and stacks of paper that we'll copy and send out to people, but we won't have a central collection place, and people won't be able to edit them or whatever, but we'll be able to share that information, but it's going to be in a little bit more of a crude manner. I'm not saying one or the other is the best or the other, but it does take different resources to do one or the other, and you really have to start from the beginning and decide, how are we going to do this, and what methods and ways are we going to go about doing this, and how are we going to be sharing information, and how are we going to be editing and adding to that information, because it really is up to you how you do it. It's just really important that as you begin, that you establish that from the beginning, and you follow through with that. Establish the method of and level of how you will report your findings, who and how are you plan to do this? Do you plan to report out in a written format? Do you plan to report out in a some kind of a legislative briefing to the legislature, to a town hall of citizenry? Are you going to publish it on your website? Are you going to do like kind of a highlights on your website of this is what we found, this is what we did, etc.? If you want a more full report, this is how you can get it. But you really need to establish that from the get-go, because it will have a lot to do with how you collect your information and how you start to formulate the reporting process, because it will look different depending on who you want to report to and how you want to report this information out. Determine how you're going to get public input. One of the key factors of the self-evaluation process under the ADA, and we'll talk about that in my second part today, is getting input from the public. You're required to engage and involve people with disabilities and get their input. So you have to start, and really before you begin, look at how are we going to do that? Are we going to involve people with disabilities all along the process? Are we going to have points of time in our process where we're going to open it up, so that we're going to do it incrementally, so that we're going to start out and look at, maybe these 6 departments and stuff, and we'll stop and evaluate how things went, and then we'll, have a public input, see how that goes, and then maybe make some revamps in our system if we need to, tweak the the mousetrap, make a better mousetrap for going forward. How we can do that? Or we're going to wait till the very end and we're going to have a big splashy show and we'll release it to the public and we'll get their input at that time. You really need to kind of figure out how you're going to do that. And what that process is going to be up front. Don't back into it. Come into it from the start. Also, what do we want to, what do we do to start, and how do we implement the changes? When we see a barrier that's identified, do we immediately implement a change as soon as we identify it? Or do we going to wait until we've collected and identified all of the barriers and then implement the changes after the fact? So it's the issue of, are we going to make changes in real time, or are we going to wait until we have all of our facts, have everything, and then implement like a line in the sand again and say from here on out we're going to change our processes and such? An example: what if I am doing an evaluation of a program and I find that program does not have a set policy, practice, and procedure for how and when they respond to requests for effective communication, whether that be a sign language interpreter, that be somebody real-time captioning, that be something printed in Braille or whatever. Do we immediately stop right then and say, okay, we're going to, this is a barrier in your agency. We are going to immediately ask you to put in place this policy, practice, or procedure? Or again, are we going to wait until we've collected what are all the barriers from that agency and then present that to them all at once and have them implement the changes as they're able to at that point? So that, really these are decisions that have to be made. And I'm not saying necessarily there's right or wrong. I mean, I'm going to say there's a wrong and that you already are doing wrong. If you don't have that policy, practice, or procedure now, you're already in the wrong. Okay, so you're already culpable, you're already liable, you already are subject to potentially a complaint being filed because you're in non-compliance. You just need to decide how and what process are we going to use to decide when and how we're going to bring ourselves into compliance in that real time, or is it going to be after the fact after we've done a full evaluation of everything that needs to be done? Cautioning, in this process is one of the things to consider as you look at this, especially if you're going to remedy something in an immediate scenario, is make sure that you start to develop a good trail for consistency. Because once you've started to implement a policy where you found one missing, you want to make sure that you're consistent at least as much as you can with an apples and apples comparison across the board. You want to make sure that whatever you're implementing after a barrier has been identified is consistent with what you've been doing overall as an organization, or you intend to do overall, so that you don't have in the end kind of a checkerboard of responses that you've done just as a knee-jerk to try to fill a void. So if you are going to decide that you're going to immediately remove that barrier that's been identified, make sure you've got some consistency across the board in how you're doing that. Before you begin, finalize what the internal resources are in terms of how much time do people have to commit to this process? How much time are we going to commit? How much time, staff time, et cetera, are we going to do? What's the financial output available to this? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in regards to some of the processes that you might decide or use to go through this. What expertise do we need? Do we have all the expertise we need internally, or do we need to, seek outside or external expertise? Internally, and as we put our team together, are people going to be assigned this task? Because this is going to be another, other duties that's assigned, or are we going to seek volunteers, people who may want to do this? I think there's pros and cons to this. And something, again, within your organizations, not being a one size fit all. One agency may decide to approach it differently than another agency based on the culture of that organization and agency. So assigning something, I may or may not get full buy-in from the people that are assigned, because they may not necessarily embrace it, but it's just been given them as a duty or a job duty. So, they may or may not embrace it, lovingly, among other things that they have to do. Whereas volunteers, you may get, a group of people who are really committed to this issue and have a real passion for it and such, who want to do it and such. So I think it's really, again, up to you as an organization, but these are things, I'm just giving you a list of things as you move forward to think about, or at least be trigger points to think about as you go forward. And then again, determine if you're going to use any outside consultants and how you're going to use them, and when and when you would pull them in, and for how long you would be using them. Be realistic about your timeframes. When you're thinking about, okay, maybe we'll contract for somebody, a consultant. Just as my own experience in working with state governments on this particular issue, some have mapped out that this is going to be, a 6 or 9 month process, and 18 months later they're still, working on it. So just be aware of that particular issue when you look at, especially outside consultant stuff. When you start to look at, putting RFPs out, or contracts and developing and stuff, recognize that may want to have clauses for extensions or things that are very concrete. So you know what you're getting into, especially from a financial perspective on that. So from the perspective of an ADA team and who you want and who you need for this, you want representatives from all areas. You want people, with skills and expertise that you need to do what you need to do. So, look at the fact that you might need somebody from finance budgeting who, can give you a picture of the cost of things. Capital planning, because, they're the folks who know what's coming up next. If we've identified barriers that might be physical in nature to a program, et cetera, they may know about the fact that, well, that building's being remodeled in 2024. So, that would be part of our planning process, would be, in the meantime, we'll have a temporary fix because we don't need a permanent fix to this issue, because in 2024, the permanent fix will come in play when that building is modified and we don't have to have an alternative method for somebody to access our programs and services, because they will be physically able to do so in this new building. Facility management, who knows and understands your facilities and knows what they can and cannot do, and what it takes to do some of those things. Somebody from the employment or with an employment perspective, because it does, HR is a key factor in the self-evaluation process. Really important that somebody who has working knowledge of how the state does contracts and purchasing, because these are critical components to your program access requirements under the ADA. A lot of what we do involves the purchasing of equipment, purchasing of contracts that we develop with external organizations and entities that provide services on our behalf. Which, we have obligations for. So it's not only just what we do directly, but it's also those things that we contract to be done on our behalf. So it's really important that that they're involved in that process. Public Works, anything that might have, a infrastructure, especially when it comes to anything like sidewalks, roads, streets, things of that nature. And then those that have communication accessibility responsibilities or expertise. So your IT folks, your people who have are dealing with your telecommunications and your internet and your apps, or any of those other kinds of things. Also, that kind of expertise is needed. And then somebody who would understand accessibility, of communication for deaf and hard of hearing and things of that nature, also would be extremely helpful from an expertise perspective as well. I mentioned earlier the importance and the requirement under the Title II of the ADA for the development of self-evaluation, that there is an involvement of people with disabilities. The regulations require that you have and provide opportunity for people with disabilities to give comment on the self-evaluation, but we also believe and really strongly support the involvement of end users in the process, because we feel that it will generate solutions that are more creative and effective. Because people with disabilities often have a lot of ideas about how something can be done. You and I might look at something from a very much more, black and white, square versus triangle kind of way to look at it, because we don't necessarily personally have the experience of having the disability. So we can kind of say, well, we think this would work, or we think this would be effective. But the end user is the one who's actually going to be able to provide you that feedback as, yes, this would be effective. And these other kinds of options might be also considered, especially when you run into situations where you might have a barrier and have to be creative about how you would deliver a service or a program, because you have a architectural barrier that precludes you from being able to provide a service in a specific way because of that architectural barrier. Also, by involving people with disabilities in your decision making, it really strengthens your accountability and really ensures that people with disabilities will use and that they will, benefit from the end result of what you have done. I mean, I can tell you a lot of examples in the work that I've done where well-meaning people have come up with, what they thought was the next, latest and greatest, mousetrap, and later find out that, their mousetrap wasn't so great after all, because they really, didn't take in consideration all the needs and things for people with disabilities. And in the end, they ended up getting a complaint filed against them. But if I had involved people with disabilities all along, and people with disabilities could help us in that prioritization and provide us with that feedback of what needs to be done, we are much more assured that we'll get buy-in from the public and that the public will be more satisfied with what our end result is. Also, when I talk about involving people with disabilities, please make sure that you consider a wide range of people with disabilities, as physical, visual, hearing, speech, intellectual, learning, behavioral, etc. Don't limit yourself to just the traditional that you think about of wheelchair user and somebody who's deaf or somebody hard hearing. Think across the board, be broad in this, because all of these groups are affected by everything that you do, and their input will be invaluable to you. Make sure the people in your team, and as you identify your team and you're working with them, make sure they're trained about the ADA. The biggest faux pas that you can possibly make is bringing people on board and having them on board and not having them be fully aware and understand the ADA. It's one thing to recruit people to be part of this process, but if they don't know the why and they don't know the how and they don't know the specifics of what is necessary and needed, then they're really not going to be very useful to you on your team. So make sure that you get everyone who's involved trained on the ADA. I'm just providing you in my handout. These are all hyperlinks to these training courses that you can do online, and I would strongly encourage, even requiring staff that go through these. But there's an ADA Basics online course. There's one that's very specific to local and state government called the Title II ADA Tutorial. Employment, there's a really good course that covers just all of the aspects of employment. And then, of course, I can't do enough to reinforce that the ADA National Symposium, which is held once a year, it's both in person and virtual. It started virtual with COVID, and they've carried it on, offering it in both a in-person and virtual method. And it covers all aspects of the ADA and has different tracks. So people who have an emphasis on employment, there's a track for employment. People with an emphasis on physical accessibility, there's a track on physical accessibility. And individuals who have who are ADA coordinators, there's a track for ADA coordinators. Individuals with special interests or expertise in the area of website and electronic accessibility, there's a track solely on electronic accessibility. So that symposium is excellent. It's offered once a year, but I really strongly encourage somebody that's doing this work, even if you are going forward, that these are ways to continue to be educated. And there's many more as well, but I'm just providing you initially just with these options. Okay, so to start with, once as you're getting started, you can't begin the process and you get your team together and you identify who is going to be on this team in this process. You have to make sure that you have looked at and identified all your program services and activities. What are they? What are the things that we're going to be looking at? And just examples, in state government, you got a Department of Revenue, the tax people, capital programs who, is involved with your construction and such, your Attorney General, who's mostly your enforcement arm, your Council on Aging, which deals primarily with the aging population, emergency management, who deals with all of the disasters and other things that happen in the state, across the state, your Human Services Agency, providing all of the social services that are usually provided by a state. Historical Society, don't forget them. They often, have properties and programs and services. Your Department of Health, which may, regulates and, may actually operate state institutions, but also regulates health providers across the state. Your Human Resources within your own state government, again, largest employer in the state. Libraries are often under the state. You have a library department or a state library. Your governor's office itself. And then you could go down from the governor's office to your other legislative entities as well that underneath that. Your Department of Natural Resources, your state police, Your planning commission that looks at the kind of the planning aspects. Your public works folks who, your Department of Transportation and those folks who look at your infrastructure. Your retirement board, dealing with your pensions and things. Your Department of Education, your K through 12 as well as your post-secondary ed. Your state treasurer, the dollars that governs a lot of the financial programs in the state. The Department of Motor Vehicles, which is a very public facing entity with everything from licensing to parking placards and all kinds of other things there. And then your Veterans Affairs. These are just a sample. It's not by no means comprehensive in any way, shape, or form, but you really need to make sure that you are drilling down into each of your departments. You start at that department level, or that agency level, and you go down below that to each one of those below that, and you look at what are the services and the programs that those entities provide that are facing the public. What are we doing that we face the public and provide service to the public directly or indirectly? It's not just because you have an office that people come into. How are they accessing you through the internet? How are they accessing you through materials that you are distributing? How are they accessing you indirectly through those that you contract with? So maybe your agency doesn't directly interface with the public, but you contract with entities that do. So emergency management itself may not be the agency that actually interfaces with the public, but they give a ton of money out to local municipalities and things of that nature for local emergency management that is funded by the state. Well, then that's a program of the state, and they have a responsibility all the way down to that local management to ensure that it's accessible, and it's part of the programs and services activities that are provided by the state. Key in the beginning process as you put your team and stuff together is to evaluate how you're going to do that. How are you going to do this process? Is it the ADA coordinator is going to direct the whole thing? Is the ADA coordinator going to do it with a team? Is it going to be done by the ADA coordinator and ADA liaisons from each department and agency? So make a correlation between team and the second and the third one. A team is basically statewide team that is made up of people of expertise, et cetera, that are going to go into those individual departments and do it. Whereas the third, being the ADA coordinator and ADA liaisons from each department and agency, means that the ADA coordinator is working with a designee or a set of designees. So you might create an ADA team in each department that is going to go down and an agency and perform this process. Or are you going to say, heck with this, is too much, this is too overwhelming, forget this, we could never do this, we'd never be able to get our act together to do this, let's hire an outside consultant who's going to do the entire thing and they'll work with the ADA coordinator directing their work, type of thing. I will just tell you that, I am familiar with several entities that have gone this route. Let me just tell you, we're talking millions of dollars. A outside consultant to come in to do an entire state self-evaluation would, cost you in the $3 to $5 million range. That's going to be the lowest you're going to get in from any kind of a outside consultant. If you're asking that consultant to do it all on their own. Now, oftentimes we'll see a consultant be hired to help the state ADA coordinator develop all the forms, to develop all the process, to train the ADA team and things of that nature. That's going to be far cheaper way to do it. So again, if I'm going to use an outside consultant, I may use them in that number 2 and number 3 format as well. So it's just something, again, you've got to decide from upfront. You've got to decide, what's our financial commitment? What are we going to do? And again, this goes back to my original thing of how much time, what are the resources that we have available to do this in order to determine how do we work? What works best for us as an organization? How are we already structured? Do we already have some kind of team available or together? We already have some kind of positions available that we could already recruit and use that structure already to carry this out. This is, again, all of these things that have to be determined up front. So getting started, once you have that team in place and you've decided the process you're going to use, the consultant or the hybrid of consultant teams, et cetera, your starting point is to get this laundry list of all programs, activity, services, and where are they located. So starting to create that inventory of what are all of our programs, activities, and services, and where do we hold them? Are they only held in one location? Are they held in multiple? Are they only virtual? There are no in-person. What are they, and what do they look like? I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to collect that in a second. Determine whether employees and officials that are familiar with the public entities ADA obligations and including that requirement to make reasonable modification to policies, practices, and procedures. So again, measuring the level of knowledge that you have among your staff. What do your frontline staff know or not know already about the obligations under the ADA? Because this is part of your evaluation process. Do people know or not know about what they basically need to do? Do people know how to arrange for auxiliary aids and services, such as sign language, braille materials, assistive listening, communication, other needs that people might have, large print, etc. Review your services, activities, and programs policies and procedures to determine whether they ensure equal opportunity for people with disabilities to participate and benefit. Do you still have any language languishing somewhere that talks about must have a sound mind and body? I recently just looked at, and this wasn't at the state level, this was at a local level of a court system. A ADA coordinator asked me to look at some of their policies, practices, and procedures, and she sent me some of them that they had. And under their policies, practices, and procedures for somebody to be a juror in this particular jurisdiction, and everyone, that's a civic duty to serve on the jury, they had language in their policy that you had to be sound mind and body. So that effectively would screen out a lot of people with disabilities who might have, mobility disabilities, might have mental illness, might have a visual impairment, a hearing impairment, or anything of that nature. So that language needed to be corrected and needed to be modified. It's amazing how many old languishing policies, practices, and procedures we often have that, have some discriminatory language. We still have policies, practices, and procedures out there that use handicapped. If I hear one more person tell me about handicapped parking, I think I'm going to strangle them. We have not had handicapped parking since the ADA passed. It is accessible parking, or it's parking for people with disabilities. It is not handicapped parking, but we see that terminology. We still see terminology retarded or other things. So in looking at all of these things, and you're drilling into all these policies, practices, and procedures, you're reviewing documents and things. This is what your process is, and this is what your starting point is what are all of those things that we need to review? Where are we? And then the survey of your facilities to determine any physical barriers, and if non-structural changes are needed, can we move a program from one place to the other? So we can still make this program accessible without having to initiate a expensive architectural change by just moving where the program is located from the second floor to the first floor to a different building or whatever. And again, the big thing is, you're going to want to decide on how are we going to document this? What kind of an action plan are we going to have? And how are we going to document that? So this is kind of the nut and bolt, but drilling down is much more involved. So I have a series of forms that I'm going to share and just talk about. These are just samples. The ADA National Network created, and I'm a member of the ADA National Network. I think in my introduction, you heard that we're one of 10 federally funded centers on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And as you get your team started, one of the key things that I mentioned earlier is deciding how you're going to document everything that you do. And the ADA National Network created a Title II Action Guide that is basically a guide that helps you go through the process of performing a self-evaluation. And it provides a number of sample forms, electronic fillable forms, that you can use and customize and not have to start from scratch. But you are welcome and fine to start your own and whatever works for you. These are just a starting point, a kickoff point. I'm always one of those people that have done better if I had something to react off of versus having to create it from the scratch myself. And so, what we do is provide you these kinds of tools to help your team get started. So this starts with just that initial inventory of who are our departments and programs. So what's the program? What's the department? Who is the liaison from that department? And then what is the date that we're going to start the evaluation with them? What's the period? And then, just a place for any comments that needed. And then this can be regularly updated on an ongoing basis. So this is just an example of that. Another form for starting to look at, our policies, practices, and procedures. This is a data sample form for our general non-discrimination obligation that we have. Do our policies, practices, and procedures provide equal opportunity for people with disabilities? Yes or no? An example, a school district requires students with autism to have a parent accompany them on a school trip. This is a discriminatory practice. So we would mark that this is discriminatory. This is, we would want to correct that. So we would identify that it's problematic, and that our next steps would be to modify this policy, and who's going to be responsible for do that. Are there circumstances that the participation of a person with a disability could be excluded or restricted? So we look at things that are there circumstances where you're required to be in person only. There's no other alternative. You can't do something by paper, or you can't do something by phone or whatever. Is it an absolute you have to be in person? Because that could potentially restrict somebody with a disability who doesn't have transportation, or somebody who has the type of disability who can't leave their home. So, again, you're going to identify these things as you go along. So this is where you start to look at your policies, practices, and procedures and collect that information. Effective communication. This is where we start to look at whether we have policies, practices, and procedures in place for specifically different types of accommodations. Sign language, oral interpreters, cued speech interpreters, video remote interpreting, computer-assisted real-time captioning, etc. So this is where we would identify: do we have the policy? Do we not have a policy? What are our next steps going to be? This is a way to document that for each of our programs, services, and activities. A sample form for website accessibility. Do we have a policy for our websites being accessible? What are we using for compliance? What standard are we using? Who's responsible? Are they aware of the policy? Are they responsible? Do they know, do they have knowledge of the standards, or do we need to provide them with training? Have we tested all pages, all aspects of our website, including the external applications that we might be using for payments, or things that if we are redirecting people to other people's websites? Yes, we cannot control those other people's websites, but if we are redirecting somebody for information from our website to somebody else's website, then we're providing that as a service. We've got some obligation to make sure we can recognize or identify that it is or not accessible, and we have to make a decision. Do we redirect people to inaccessible websites? If the answer is yes, that things are accessible, do people that use a screen reading or other kinds of assistive technology? Yes or no? And then, is there a plan for making the existing web content accessible if it's not accessible, and how are we going to go about doing that? So again, just a way to collect information. Not saying that they're just samples. Change it, do it, use it, whatever works for you. This is why your team would meet and develop these things. For your administrative requirements, first and foremost, have you done what you're supposed to do? If not, you got a problem. Have you done the public notice? Have you done the grievance procedure? Do you have an ADA coordinator? Check off those administrative requirements to make sure you have all of those in place as well. And then program accessibility. This is when we start to look at our programs being accessible in their entirety. So we look at whether or not individuals viewed in their entirety are able to access our programs, services, and activities. So if we need to make non-structural solutions to make our program accessible, so we're going to move something from one floor to another floor, then that's going to be a non-structural solution. If we have to do a structural solution to that, which means we need to install a ramp, we need to put an automatic door opener on, we need to do whatever, then we're going to note what that is, and when that's going to be done, how that is going to be done. So again, another way to collect information, or just a sample to collect information on this particular topic or issue. This gets down to the action plan. So this is where you actually now you've done all your data collection, Now you're going to identify, all right, these are all of the things that we identified that we have a problem with. All of this data that we collected drills down to the fact that we're missing a policy on this in 2, 3, 4, 5 of our departments. We are missing 6 of our 15 web pages under the Department of Revenue found accessibility problems. The other 15 pages were all fine. We're going to fix those 15 pages. Here's who's responsibility to do it. Here's the date that we're going to have it done, and any comments associated with it. So your action plans becomes your really livable, breathable document that you move forward with. This is where you actually document the who, what, and where of what is going to need to be done from all of the other data that you've collected, where you've identified the problems. Here's where you're going to drill down into the things that need to be changed and who's going to do it and what's the time frame that we're going to go about for doing that. So again, you can document it many ways, but we really highly recommend that you make this a living, breathing document and that your work is never done and you understand that this process never finishes. Because every time, and this is in my ideal world, and I don't know if I'll ever probably be around when the ideal world is realized, but that we won't need to do these kinds of things anymore because we will be fully accessible. We will have taken into consideration all of the potential issues of accessibility from the point that we created the program. We won't do it after the fact. We won't be, oh yeah, we just created this new program. Did we take people into disabilities in consideration? Did we remember to do that? Or did we make sure that we did that? That it will be something that's ingrained and is automatically done. But until then, this kind of a self-evaluation process will be something you should revisit on a regular basis to go back and make sure that all of your programs, you kind of draw a line in the sand. And, you know, at the end of 2022, we've done all the programs that we knew about at the end of 2022. But in the end of 2023, we're going to go back and reflect and say, what were the new programs that we created? We eliminated some, so we're going to take those off the list, but we created new programs in 2023. Let's go back and revisit those and make sure that those are also in compliance. Let's do a cursory review to make sure that we've dotted all the I's and crossed the T's. And so this document lives on, and you can continue to document the process. And you know, may want to keep your team in place or keep a subset of your team in place to be able to revisit these things on an ongoing basis. There's a lot of other resources. One of them is the Department of Justice Title II Toolkit. It has a number of different chapters addressing a variety of different issues for creating a self-evaluation. They have a lot of great checklists also to take a look at in compiling your final checklists or documents for collecting all of your necessary information during the self-evaluation process. So I know I'm near my time or at my time almost, and so I'm just entertain if there are any questions that I might be able to answer, and hope that you will be joining me for part 2 of this session.
Yes, Robin, we do have one question in there. Can we get a copy of those forms that you've presented? They yeah, seem to have some interest.
Yes, definitely. When you get my PowerPoint, there's a hyperlink to each one of them in the PowerPoint presentation.
Great. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat now so that we can have Robin address them before we run out of time.
Oh, great. I guess that gives us a few more minutes then before the next session. All right, I will just continue my presentation. Does that conclude for us today?
Thank you, Robin, very much. Just want to let the audience know too, for state agencies, boards and commissions, we will have a process for our self-evaluation. So this is very informative, what Robin's providing for us, and part 2 is going to be very important as well. Fred, if there's any other concluding comments, you can do that now.
No, just pointing out that we do have the link in case you did not register for the second part of this. So please feel free to follow that on to the next session. We thank you so much, Robin. Thank you for everyone for attending. We hope you enjoyed this very informative session. If you did have questions later on, please feel free to contact the Office of Disability Inclusion at odi@das.ohio.gov. And we do appreciate and encourage you to provide your feedback regarding this session on the link that's in the Q&A. Thank you again, everyone, and thank you so much, Robin.
Great. Thank you. Bye now.